Cold War? I'm not so sure. The Soviet Union imploded. It committed suicide. And at some point decided that instead of putting a gun to its adversaries in the West, it put a gun to its own head. Now, Putin is trying to rectify that. That's another story, and we shall see how that plays out. Now, second memory, so that's 9/11. Now, second memory, I'll make this a little briefer because it's more of an anecdote. In 2005, I flew from New York to Islamabad to report on the effects of the 2005 earthquake in Kashmir. And I don't know how many of you remember this, but it was one of the great disasters in terms of earthquakes in recent history. 70,000 people were killed, entire communities trapped in high mountains in northern Pakistan. And at the time, the United States had large forces in neighboring Afghanistan, and it was only the U.S. with those twin-rotor Chinook helicopters that was providing massive amounts of humanitarian aid, bringing people off the mountains, providing critically needed medical care. The country of Pakistan was really on its feet, and it was the United States that was carrying this. And in my then innocent youth, I thought, oh, this will be a great campaign for the hearts and minds of Pakistanis to show that the United States really is there when they need it. Anyway, I flew from New York to Islamabad, but the flight first, when you fly Pakistani Airways, the flight first took me through London. And the journal was very generous. They put me on a business class flight. So when I got to London, I had some time to kill. And so I sat in the business class lounge, and who should show up? I'm just sort of sitting there, minding my own business, reading whatever I'm reading. And these three characters, young men, showed up, and they were dressed in the sort of very traditional Pakistani garb that goes down to their knees, all in white. They were young Englishmen. They spoke with classic sort of London accents. They all had long beards. There were clearly, the beards gave them away as sort of Hizb ut-Tahrir extremist radicals. And so they said, we started talking. They said, what do you do? I said, I'm a journalist. I didn't mention, I'm past editor-in-chief of flagship Zionist newspaper, and by the way, I'm staying at the Serena Hotel in Islamabad. You can find me in room 211. Just, I'm a journalist for the Wall Street Journal. I'm going to go cover the earthquake. So we started chatting, and they were going to go on what they called a humanitarian charity mission connected to some sort of vague charity. I was not tempted to inquire too deeply. But what interested me is something got on the conversation of a movie that they were very animated about, and that was Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11. And they viewed Fahrenheit 9/11 is essentially a statement of reality, that Michael Moore had essentially uncovered the internal dynamics of the Bush administration, the reason the United States had gone to war on 9/11, and they saw this as a kind of a gospel truth. And it made this, just talking to them, it wasn't like a profound conversation. They weren't making, references to Thomas Mann, and I was retorting with Hannah Arendt. One of these conversations you have. And you think, these are these young British guys, and who are they pumped up on? Well, they're pumped up on whatever their imam is telling them, certainly enough to get them on a plane to go back to the homeland, back to Pakistan. But they're also watching Western media and Western critiques of what is happening, of then Bush administration policy. And they take it quite seriously. They are participating in the culture and the popular popular political culture in the West. And this kind of squared with the fact that when Osama bin Laden, late and very unlamented, would occasionally go and make his videos, he would make references to people like Noam Chomsky, the hero of every college campus bookstore. You can find his 37 volumes of poetry, I'm sure any of the nearest universities. So these figures who were kind of the countercultural heroes of the American Academy also were filtering into the thinking of these characters who were off probably to go make jihad or something close to jihad in the Pakistani hinterlands. And I've often wondered what became of these characters that I encountered there. was a small memory, but I think it was a very telling moment, because you understood that when we talk about Islam, we're not talking about something that's happening sort of in imams in a language we have no understanding of, but we're talking about a kind of cross-pollination between Islamist theology and postmodern left-wing Western politics and academic politics. It's not an accident, by the way, that when you meet some of the intelligentsia of the Iranian establishment, many of these people have degrees, even if they probably never quite completed their degrees, but they have degrees from Western universities, and many of the leaders of both in Iran and also in Sunni Islam have degrees from the States. Mohammed Morsi, the former president of Egypt, used to teach at one of the University of California state school systems. I interviewed the deputy head of the Muslim Brotherhood. He had a master's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Missouri. So it's what you find, very much like the way that Pol Pot, supposedly Cambodian nationalist, and many of his people had been educated in France and had sort of taken away the ideological impulses of France in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. The Iranian Revolution was spawned by people who went to American universities in the 1970s, and Al-Qaeda and a lot of this the Sunni radicalism came from people who also had been in Western universities and had imbibed, sucked up that culture in the 1980s and 90s. Now, a final memory to kind of conclude this and hope make some kind of coherent point. In 2007, I flew to Jakarta to interview the former president of Indonesia, a guy by the name of Abdul Rahman Wahid, better known to Indonesians as Gus Dur. And Gus Dur had, for a very brief and unhappy period, been president of Indonesia after the fall of the Sukarno regime, but he was better known as the head of the Nahdlatul Ulama, which is a Muslim social movement comprising something like 40, it's the largest social movement in the world. There are 40 or 45 million Muslim Indonesians belong to the NU, the Nahdlatul Ulama. And Gus Dur was a remarkable character. He died a couple of years after our interview. He was a Sunni religious scholar. His scholarship was beyond dispute. But he had spent time in his youth both in Cairo and Baghdad, being educated at Al-Azhar University in Cairo and the University of Baghdad, and hating his Muslim education. And one of the most remarkable things that happened, I'll never forget this. I go into this office, he's this blind Islamic cleric, and sits there and says, "I understand you used to be editor of the Jerusalem Post." Yes, in fact, I was. Love Israel. Terrific country. And then he just sort of went on, and this was a guy who was a genuine liberal. And we spent about 2 or 3 hours having a conversation about the nature of modern Western liberalism. He was talking about Hamilton, talking about Jefferson, talking about Locke and Rousseau. And this is a guy who had swum as a young man in the 1940s and 1950s in the culture, the old culture of the Western liberal political tradition. And so I asked him, well, why is it that this culture that you clearly are participating in never took hold in a younger generation of Muslims? Never took hold in the generation of you mentioned the year 1979. It was in fact a seminal year. And he had an amazing answer. You have to imagine this interview. Okay, this is Jakarta. It's steaming hot. I'm interviewing the head of the NU, this blind, deposed president, ex-cleric, and he says, the person I blame is Auguste Comte. Okay, well, why? And Comte, I'm sure some of you in this room know, is the sort of father of positivism. Basically, he blamed the French, which was just music to my ears. Quebec is just across the river. Right? Anyway, yeah, I take that back. But his idea was that the problem with positivism is that it was a version of Western philosophy that had no internal spiritual content. There was something hollow about positivism, just as there was something hollow about the pragmatism of sort of latter-day positivists like William Dewey, the famous University of Chicago educator, that somehow Western teaching had been eviscerated, had its guts, or not its, if not its guts, its soul taken out of it. And so a lot of Muslims who went into Western universities in the 1960s and 1970s encountered a version of liberalism which was, in a sense, soulless, had no actual moral content, was defined entirely in a negative sense. What was rights? It was the freedom from. There was no kind of positive content to a liberal agenda. It was simply the right to be left alone, to do everything you possibly want to be able to do, so long as, in the John Stuart Mill sense, it doesn't quite touch the tip of the next man's nose. This is a very, profound thought that Gustor is attempting to communicate, which is that the problem that we may have when we're talking about the confrontation with Islam may indeed lie in places like Raqqa and Mosul, and where ISIS is taking hold, and in the kind of education that's coming out of Al-Azhar. But it's also happening because over the past 20, 40, 60 years, Western philosophy has been denuded. Western philosophy has had its soul taken out of it. Western philosophy has come to be defined, liberalism has come to be defined in a purely negative sense. Everything is permitted unless it's explicitly forbidden, and it's only forbidden if it can show actual moral, or not moral harm, but actual physical harm or material harm. Not moral harm, not spiritual harm. So this is, I think, something that we need to think about, because what I see, just if I can connect these anecdotes, is this, that really what we're encountering in the confrontation with radical Islam, we're also encountering as a problem within the West, and a problem with how we go about defining liberalism to ourselves so that we can think about it in a way that demands that we defend it, and to others so that we can export it. We can explain it. We can proselytize for an idea of liberty that is more than simply an idea about absence. That's really the question that we are dealing with. And I don't think, we're talking about the long, your time references are long and I think in many ways very apt. But I don't think that we're ever going to begin to